Hello 3B students, hope you all are doing well. Welcome to this week's video lecture, which is going to be teaching you some more reading skills, critical reading skills that are focused on making inferences and using context clues. So your lesson objectives, by the end of your lesson, you will be able to understand the concept of making inferences from a given text. And then you'll also, after understanding that, be able to apply some inferencing skills to solve riddles and also get messages from TV shows and reading passages. You'll also understand what context clues are and what their use is. And then you'll also, like for inferences, apply your understanding of context clues to understand the meaning of unknown words in a given sentence. But first, let's quickly review our quiz from last week, which was focused on testing your knowledge about skimming and scanning texts. So let's first go over the true and false questions. So number one was, we scan a text when we want to read quickly to understand the gist or main idea. We skim a text when we want to look closely at certain words and details. And we know that this is false because it's the other way around. So we scan a text when we want to look closely at certain words and details. From a question or something. We skim a text when we want to read it quickly just to get the main idea, right? So it's just the opposite. The beginning and end of paragraphs are good places to look to help you understand the main idea, and this is true because we know that the topic sentence and the concluding sentence of paragraphs are usually places where the author discusses or suggests what the main idea is. On the line questions ask us to look beyond or outside of the words in a text to think about its bigger meanings and ideas. So we know that this is false because on the line questions don't ask us to think about bigger or broader ideas. Really, they just ask us to look for specific details, words in the text so that we can answer the question and use facts to answer the question, right? When we scan a text, we read the questions for their keywords before the text. We know that this is true, right? So we read the on-the-line questions and they ask us about a specific fact or something in the text, and then we get keywords from that question and then we look for those in the text so that we can find the answer to the question. And so here is some vocabulary. So as an American, he has to blank his visa so that he can stay in Cambodia longer than he planned. So yeah, end, shorten, extend, or fine, right? So here we know the answer is going to be extend, because extend is to lengthen or make longer, right? You can see how much he cares about teaching because he's always so kind and blank to his students. So we say fine, accessible, strange, or commercial. So here we know that the answer is going to be accessible, and so accessible is just the adjective form of access, right? And access is to be able to get near or close to someone, right? So if we say that he's accessible to his students, that means he's always available. People can always access him for questions, comments, etc. And all of the other answers do not really make sense in the context of this sentence. If we have a healthy relationship with ourselves, then we are better able to blank into the best version of ourselves. Extend, evolve, fall, or think. And so here we deduce that the answer is evolve, right? Is to gradually change into or to become, right? So if we are healthy with ourselves, we love ourselves, and we're able to be with ourselves, then we're able to become who we really want to be, right? The truck can only be rented and used for blank purposes and not personal ones. So then we have family, small, private, or commercial, and here we know that the answer is going to be commercial, right? Because commercial we know has to do with selling or buying products, right? And for like economic or business purposes, right? Personal ones are going to be family, small, or maybe private, right? So commercial is the only answer that is different than the rest. An advertisement can be a great tool for blank a new product onto the market. So launching, keeping, accessing, or testing, and we know that this answer is going to be launching, right? Launching is to put something onto a market, to put something out for the first time, right? And it's usually a big deal to introduce something new. Keeping, accessing, and testing are not correct in this context of this sentence. One issue that many migrants in Southeast Asia face is insufficient or not enough blank to free and affordable healthcare and social protections. Access, acceptance, doctors, abilities. And so here we know the answer is going to be access, because access we know is to get close or near to, or to obtain or to get something, right? So we know that access makes most sense in this context of this sentence. Okay, great. So now let's move on to our lesson this week, which is focused on inferences and using context clues. So just to think about as we go into our lesson, when in your life do you make conclusions or judgments about things using your own ideas and observations? And are there times when you understand what someone, so like a parent, a friend, an author of a text, a singer, is trying to say, but they're not saying it directly, right? So I want you to think about that as we go into our lesson today. So our lesson is partly on making inferences. So in your life in general, but also when you're reading texts, it's important to be able to make inferences in order to understand meaning, because we are not always told exactly how or why something is, right? And we know that inferences can come in the form of conclusions, predictions, what we think will happen, or new ideas, right? So an inference is a conclusion that we make about something based on evidence or information that we find, reasoning, so just logical reasoning, like what makes the most sense, and our own experiences and knowledge that we've gained from those experiences, right? And so an inference is not something that is told to us explicitly, but it's something that we think to be true because of what we see, observe, what we know, and what we think, right? So it's important to know that an inference is not something that is necessarily true. It's something that we think maybe is true based on what we have in front of us, what we've experienced. But it's our own idea, right? It's something that we think to be true, and other people might have different inferences, right? And our inference, we might think that it is true in real life, but it might actually not be correct, right? So it's important to know that. So one example is here. We look at this picture, and what do we see? We see a person, it looks like a woman, and she is tasting something or she's eating something, but she doesn't really look like she's having a good time, right? So an inference, something that we observe or maybe think to be true about this scene, right, is that this woman does not like the food she is eating, right? We don't know, that might be wrong. Like, she might like the food, or she might just not be hungry, right? That's another inference we can make, is this woman is not hungry. She does not want to eat, but she has to eat so that she can stay healthy, right? So an example here is of making an inference based on what we see and observe. So we know, past knowledge is that when someone makes a face like that, we know that they're not happy and they don't want to eat something, right? And so we see in the picture too that she's making the face, she's holding a spoon, she looks like she's going to eat, but she doesn't really look like she wants to eat, right? So an inference that we might make is that she does not like the food she's eating. And so we know that that's an inference, but what is not an inference? So let's look at these. So Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States from 1861 to 65. The earth is round. Paris is the capital city of France. And water is made up of H2O molecules. So these are not inferences. And what do all of these have in common? Well, all of these are facts, right? So these are facts that are just true. We know that they're true. They can't be denied. We know that they're not wrong. So we don't make an inference based on a fact, right? So a fact is just a fact. An inference is not always true, right? It's something that we think maybe is true or that could be possible based on what we think. But facts are just facts, right? And so facts are what we use to answer on-the-line questions, right? They're just facts, they're stated, they can't change, right? An inference can change based on what other evidence that we gather and what new information we get, right? So a lot of times we make inferences in everyday life. So for example, I woke up too late this morning at 10 o'clock. I set my alarm for 8 a.m. before I went to bed. So I must have slept through my alarm. So here we're making an inference. We're saying, since I set my alarm, it's probably just my alarm went off, but I just slept through it. I didn't hear it, right? So that's an example of something we make an inference. We say, this is probably why this happened, but we don't know. No one is telling us. We don't have the answer. We won't ever have the answer, right? And so what are some examples of ways that you make inferences in your everyday life? So some examples might be, trying to figure out what someone is trying to say or what they want, right? But they might not say it specifically. Figuring out what is happening in a movie, right? And it's important just to think about more ways that you have to make inferences in your daily life, in your job, at school. And so, like we do make inferences in our daily lives, one example is we try to understand what people are trying to say without them directly saying it. We also do that when we're reading a text. So that's an example of when we read between the lines in a text, is when we read a text closely to try to understand the message that an author wants to communicate without directly stating it. This is very common. You'll find this in many texts, particularly fictional texts, so fantasy stories and things that are not stories that maybe aren't true, when the author is trying to say something or show a character who is trying to say something but without actually saying exactly how they feel. So it makes the reader have to think about and think beyond the words and look between the lines and think about what is actually trying to be said, right? Example is, let's look at the following riddle. I love my job. I go to the hospital every day and I take care of my patients. Who am I, right? So maybe we try to think about, if this person, they go to the hospital every day, it's their job, they take care of patients, right? So who are they? We probably would make the inference that they are a doctor or a nurse, right? This is based on what they say, what they describe, but they don't actually say, oh, I'm a doctor or a nurse, right? And it's important here to also to remember that this person could be a doctor or a nurse. So if let's say we say a doctor and they're a nurse, our inference would be wrong, but it would not be too wrong, right? So it's important to note that inferences, they can be wrong. They might not always be 100% correct, but the point of making inferences is to try to get at the main idea or the general idea of what something might be like or what might be true, right? So inferences, try to understand what generally something is, the idea. We might not be 100% correct with the details, right? So one example is, let's make some inferences from this text. So we say, this young woman, let's read it. The young woman was unsure and hesitant as she walked towards the famous Italian restaurant. Her parents gave her a reason for meeting them at the restaurant and not at the house, but she didn't believe it. To make things worse, she was a bit grumpy or in a bad mood because she was still catching up on the sleep that she lost during exam time. She noticed some cars looked familiar in the parking lot. As soon as she walked through the door, she heard, "Surprise!" So what are some inferences that we can make from this text passage? So we know that the text says the young woman was unsure and hesitant as she walked towards the restaurant. So I know that when people are unsure and hesitant, they're uncomfortable because they don't have all the information they want, right? So maybe she is nervous and doesn't want to go into the restaurant because she doesn't know what to expect, right? So that's an inference that we make based on what the text says and what we know, right? And this is an inference about a character's feelings or disposition. But we also know that the text says her parents gave her a reason for meeting them at the restaurant and not at the house, but she didn't believe it. So I know that sometimes when we tell jokes, people don't believe them. So her parents might be playing a practical joke on her, right? That's an inference about a person's thinking or feeling based on what they believe, right? The text says, to make things worse, she was a bit grumpy or in a bad mood because she was still catching up on the sleep that she lost during exam time. And so I know that exams are usually given in high school or college, and she is described as a young woman. So she's probably a high school or college level student. It's an inference that we can make. An inference about a person's identity or profile based on their activities, right, or what they do. Finally, the text says, she noticed some cars looked familiar in the parking lot. As soon as she walked through the door, she heard, "Surprise!" And so I know that if there are familiar cars or cars that we recognize, it means that they probably belong to people we know, right? And so now I'll probably change my inference and I'll say, if her parents wanted to meet her at the restaurant and other people she knows are there, then it's probably a surprise party for her, right? And this is an inference about the situation based on the description of the scene, right? And so inferences can also be made in the form of predictions, right? So we might say, because the young woman was in a grumpy mood before and hesitant because she didn't know what was going on, she will be surprised and happy when she learns that it is a party for her and she can see her friends and family, right? So we make a prediction. This is an inference, right? Based on what we know happened in the text. And so some strategies for making inferences in text are to make sure you read the passage carefully and pay attention to details. And you know that details can include word choice, tone or the way something is expressed or said, a scene and character description, right? Behaviors, actions, and interactions between characters. And it's important to think about how the ideas in the passage relate to or remind you of your own knowledge and experiences, right? So we use our own knowledge. We know that, oh, okay, when people yell surprise, that's a surprise party probably. So we know that from our own knowledge and experiences, and we connect that to whatever we're reading or watching to make an inference about it, right? And whenever you're making inferences in text, try to ask yourself, okay, what is my inference or what am I saying? What information did I use to make this inference? So clues from the text, my own knowledge. How good was my thinking, right? So was it accurate based on reality? So we can look back and see, okay, what actually happened, or what did the author say that they wanted to say, right? And then so do I need to change my thinking, right? So in the example, we changed our inference, right? We thought, oh, her parents are just playing a joke on her. But then we realized, oh, her parents actually, they wanted her to meet them at the restaurant because it was a surprise party, right? So sometimes we change our thinking based on new evidence or information that we have, right? And so we make inferences when we answer between the line questions. So between the line questions, they're not like on the line questions. Ask you to make inferences rather than state facts that can be taken directly from the text. So an inference is a broader idea. So examples are, what does the author mean when they say this? What can we conclude about this from this passage? Why do you think X character did this? And what do you think is the reason she's acting like that, right? So for homework, I want you guys to read this passage about hybrid cars, right? And I want you to try to make an inference about what can you infer about hybrid cars from the passage on the previous slide, right? So I want you guys to do that for homework, and we'll talk about that at a later time, right? So have you ever read a text and not understood certain words and phrases? What did you do? Did you look up all of the words and phrases, or did you try to read the whole thing and understand the text's overall meaning? All right, so I want you to think about those questions. So now we're going to talk about context clues. So in your life, in general, one way to better understand a text and also make inferences, right, is to use context clues, right? So context clues are hints found in a sentence, a paragraph, or a passage that a reader can use to understand the meaning of a certain word, group of words, or phrase, okay? So context clues, when we use them to infer the meanings of words, we better remember and understand the meaning of them because we can see the ways in which they are used, right? So we learn and remember words better when we try to use context clues to understand and not just looking words up in a dictionary and writing down their definitions, right? Because sometimes that can help, but it doesn't really help us remember the word and how it is used, right? So let's just practice a little bit using context clues. So I want you guys to read each sentence and try to think about, what do you think the underlined word means in each sentence, right? So thanks to the invention of the car, transportation is much easier. In the past, people used nubits to get around. The task was so nubitous for the students that it took them 4 hours to complete it. They told us how difficult it was. Stop nubiting around. It's time you start being serious and get to work. He has strong nubition. Whenever he speaks, everyone wants to pay attention to his ideas, and they are inspired by what he has to say. The city is so nubis to the village, it's like going from one world to another when stepping from one into the other. And so now let's look at different types of context clues by looking at the examples that we just went over. So there's different types of context clues or hints that we can find in a sentence that show us or suggest what the meaning of a word is, right? So explanation. So one type of a context clue is explanations, which show the context of the word, right? So in the first sentence, we saw, thanks to the invention of the car, transportation is much easier. In the past, people used nubits to get around. So here we might ask, what does nubits mean? Well, we see that a nubit, it was a form of transportation. It was used before cars, right? So we might infer that it means a horse, a bicycle, or feet, right? Which are modes of transportation that they used before cars were invented, right? Another type of context clue is explanation as well. So here's another example. He has strong nubition. Whenever he speaks, everyone wants to pay attention to his ideas and they are inspired by what he has to say, right? So because everyone respects and admires his speaking, we can infer that nubition is a noun meaning presence or influence or ability or charisma, right? So we don't know what nubition means, right? But based on what happens when he speaks, right, we probably think that nubition has this meaning. Another type of context clue is synonyms, right? So when we see words nearby that have the same meaning. So here we say, the task was so nubitous for the students that it took them 4 hours to complete it. They told us how difficult it was. So here we see the students say that the task was difficult, and here it's described as nubitous, right? So since nubitous and difficult are both used to describe the task, we can infer that nubitous means difficult or challenging, right? And then, so we also have antonyms too. So when we see words nearby that have the opposite meaning. So stop nubiting around, it's time you start being serious and get to work. So this person's saying, stop doing this and start doing this, right? So see that nubiting is discouraged, while being serious is encouraged and associated with work, right? So we think that nubiting is probably means something about chilling or being silly or not really being serious, right? Another type of context clue is comparisons, when we show the meaning of a word by comparisons to other items, similes, or metaphors, right? So the city is so nubis to the village, it's like going from one world to another when stepping from one to the other, right? So since someone can step from the city to the village, and there's nothing that seems to be between the city and the village, we can probably infer that nubis is a preposition meaning next, right? So next or right near. Another type of context clue is contrast, so when we show the meaning of a word by using items or elements that are not similar, right? So I know she said she could reconstitute the dried fruit, but a wet raisin just isn't a grape. So here we see that a raisin is just a dried up grape. That's our knowledge, we know that. And the raisin is wet, so we think that this person maybe is trying to make the raisin a grape again by making it wet and giving it water. So we might think that reconstitute means to bring something back to its original state, or to make a raisin a grape again means to make it what it originally was, right? Another type of context clue is word structure. So when we understand the base word and prefix or suffix when they're placed together. So pro-environment, the pro-environment activists protested the government's new laws that allow more companies to deforest the land, right? So we know that pro means for or in support of, right? And if we also know that environment means the environment, like the earth, right? We can infer that pro-environment means for or in support of the environment or earth, right? So one more example of a context clue is word structure. So when we know a word origin, so we recognize the word, but it's a different word, right? And we see the new word with similar origin, we can infer its meaning, right? So the book was dedicated in memoriam of his father. Since we know the word memorial means remembrance of someone who is dead, right? We can infer that in memoriam means in remembrance or honor of someone who died, right? So some strategies and tips for using context clues. While there will be some words that are just too difficult to figure out without a dictionary, you might need the dictionary or the teacher. It is always best to first try using the context of the word, the surrounding context, to see if we can get an idea of its meaning, right? And it's best to read an entire passage also, or text, without looking at every word you don't know. So try to read the whole passage, maybe mark the words that you don't know, but try to understand the meaning of the whole passage, and then go back and try to understand the words if you want. And look around a word for context. So it can be a small hint, a more direct definition, an explanation, or an illustration, right? So the context, it can be different context, could be a hint, could be anything that might give you an idea of what the word means. The same words can also have different meanings, so just use context clues that can help you understand how the same word can be used in different contexts, right? And when you write down new vocabulary, try to write down not just the words, but the whole sentence and phrase in which it was used, right, and where you found it, right? So write down the context too. And also try to look for other examples of how the word is used on the internet or elsewhere in the text, and write down those examples too. And so for your homework, I want you to practice using context clues. Try to figure out the meaning of the underlined words without using a dictionary, right? So you can pause the video at this time and look at these examples. And I'll give you the answers to these this week, okay, so we can review. And thank you so much for listening and paying attention to our video lecture this week on making inferences and using context clues. I hope that you enjoyed it. Please, as always, write down any questions that you have and ask those at our Zoom session this week. I look forward to seeing you then. And until then, please have a wonderful day and afternoon. And we all miss you very much at Prickly. Okay, bye-bye.